Reggie here, and I want to welcome you to another one of my videos. In this video, we are going to take some time to talk about comics that you shouldn't invest in. And I'm using air quotes because there are folks that have different definitions for what an investment is. A lot of times people think that if you spend money, that is an investment. If you buy a comic, that is an investment. I don't necessarily subscribe to that belief. I personally think of investing as a spectrum. It is a risk-return spectrum. On one end of that spectrum, you have low-risk type of purchases that tend to yield low to moderate returns. Not necessarily bad, but not as high-performing. And you typically hold those types of investments or those purchases for a longer period of time. On the other end of the spectrum, you have your high risk and potentially highly profitable type of purchases that you can make, typically held for a short period of time. It is a spectrum. Low risk, low return, higher risk, higher return. That is how I think about it. But again, people think of that in terms of an investment. Well, yes, it is an investment, but that's a lot of stuff that you're cramming into that one word. I like to think of investments as the lower end of that spectrum. Low risk, lower return, moderate return. On the other end, I think of it as speculation. Now, there are some folks that heard me just say speculation and automatically were like, no, that is bad. That is dirty. I do not believe that speculation is bad. I think that speculation is a natural part of the hobby. I think if it is taken to the extreme, it can be detrimental. But someone that purchases a comic and turns around and sells that comic for a profit isn't necessarily a bad person. They may be doing it because they're a dealer or because they need to pay bills or that is their business, or they are doing it to buy books that they really want to hold for the long term. So they're speculating in these higher risk type of things in order to take that cash and invest it into something that is more meaningful to them. Again, that is not necessarily a bad thing, but when taken to the extreme, it can absolutely be bad. But in this video, what I want to do is to talk about that upper quadrant, right? I don't want to talk about the blue chip comics. I want to talk about the speculative arm or wing, if you will, of this spectrum that we just spoke about. Now, why is it important to make this distinction between the two? I think that it's important because it helps you to figure out where, how, and when you actually want to spend your money, and moreover, how that purchase is likely to perform. Generally speaking, if you have a blue chip comic, it is going to have some ebbs and flows over the course of the year, but generally it is going to do well. And I've spoken about these blue chip type comics in other videos that you may want to check out. But we're going to focus on this side, right? We're going to focus on the spectrum, the upper end of that spectrum. And I want to give you some things to think about and to consider. Now, what's really important here is that I am not saying that you should not buy these books. I am suggesting that you want to think about buying these books, and if you decide to pull the trigger, make sure you consider all of the factors. The first tip that I want to offer up is that you want to be cautious about the fad comic, especially when the fad comic drops. And I'm talking about those really awesome, pretty, shiny foil comics as an example that come in a plethora of colors, right? They all look the same. They're just different colors and they are released in different quantities. You want to be careful with the fad book. Generally speaking, that fad book is going to take off like a rocket and then it is going to experience a dip. Potentially, that dip will be permanent. Sometimes the comic will actually recover. Now, do you want to buy at the peak or do you want to buy after the peak at some point? That's what you have to think about. And so when that book drops, it is going to be hot. Everyone's going to want it. You're going to see it on Instagram. You're going to feel FOMO. You're going to feel that internal angst to actually get the book. But if you don't, if you do not buy it right away, you could pick that book up at a later date for a better price, or you'll realize that you really don't want it after all. The second type of book that you want to avoid investing in is one that features an unproven character. And we are talking about first appearances or undervalued comics, which is a term you hear a lot. You want to give some serious thought as to whether these are the types of books that you want to spend big money on. And I say this because the character is unproven. The character may not actually catch fire. It may not build a fan base that will allow the value of that comic to be sustained over time. Again, that isn't to say that new characters are bad. It's simply to say, do you want to wait to actually pick that book up? Again, a lot of these books catch fire immediately and then they begin to cool off. And it is in that cool off period that you may actually be able to pick up that very same comic for a reasonable price. If you've been around this hobby for any period of time, you can probably name on your fingers and your toes all of the hot comics and characters that have dropped in just the last few years alone that we really haven't seen do much. And there are a lot of them. Doesn't mean that they're not bad. I mean, I'm not saying that they're bad. I'm simply saying you want to be smart about when you spend your money and what you choose to speculate on. The next type of book that you want to avoid is the hot book of the day or the week. And we all know what that book is. We all know because as soon as you open your Instagram feed, you see it. You see people digging it out of their long boxes or their short boxes. You hear the stories of them running from shop to pick it up, and all you see is the shop in the background with the book in the foreground, right? It is that book that takes off on the day that it drops. It is also the book that appears on eBay the day that it drops for 3, 4, 5 times the amount of money of what it actually costs from the LCS directly. You want to avoid those books because generally those books do not pay off in the long term. They really don't. Now, if you happen to pick one up, I would say sell it. Sell it and take your cash and run. But as a buyer, because this is sort of a buyer video, you probably want to avoid those books because you're going to spend a lot more money for that book only to watch the value of that book drop off. Now, this isn't just a cautionary note around new books that are dropping. There are hot books that pop up all the time, which takes me to my next point. The book that becomes hot because of the movie or the TV show, the speculation around that, the book that everyone overlooked in the dollar bin for years after years after years, that suddenly becomes hot. Generally, again, you want to avoid those types of books. Not that they're bad, but simply because you're more than likely going to spend more money for that book than what it is actually worth, long term. These, in many ways, are speculative buys. These are books that are going to come out, they're going to get hot, they're going to drop off, and you, if you still want to, can pick them up for a much better price a little later. Now, this is not absolute. It's not absolute because there are going to be some books that are going to come out and they're going to take off and they're never going to come down. But I would bet you dollars to donuts that there are more books that come out and drop than there are that take off and never return back to a normal price. This channel and this video are all about helping people to be smarter about the hobby of comic book collecting. My hope is that I've said something in this video that might actually help you. If you haven't yet subscribed to the channel, I want to personally invite you to do that now. Just go ahead and tap that button, turn on notifications, and that way you won't miss out on any of the content that I release. If you want to reach out to me directly, you can do that on Instagram at Regie Collects. Take care.
This thing on? Mic check. I just want to make sure y'all can hear me clearly. Yo. Should you practice art? Or should art be your practice? I had a question, so I asked it. Not to anyone specifically, but to my inner God, you know? The one that's gonna be a master. The one that's more than a rapper. The one that's an educator. The one that seeks enlightenment. He travels with concepts. He's got the mindset expansive. He understands that his time combined with travel and concepts makes his mind convex. Sort of like when you look at a brain scan. Straight off meditation, we was concaving until we had that eternal dialogue that created our dialect. Now we in distinct rooms of pure souls having them conversations. Synergy and combinations. You fly and we waiting. Indian style in the gold.